We're constantly being bombarded by physical stimuli. For example, the light coming into our eyes, the sound waves coming into our ears, the surfaces that our bodies are currently touching. These physical stimuli are converted by the nervous system into electrical and chemical signals. Once done, such electrical and chemical signals are processed and managed by the billions of neurons that exist in your nervous system. The purpose of neurons in the nervous system is simply to transport and send information around the body. Your brain determines what neurons, and hence physical stimuli, you pay attention to. For example, you're probably not aware of the surface you are touching right now while reading this sentence, despite there being physical stimuli that are constantly coming into your body, telling you how you are sitting on such surface right now, or lying down, or standing up. I don't think you'd be standing up watching this video, but maybe. It is good that the brain chooses what neurons we pay attention to, because if we were aware of all the physical stimuli coming into our body, we would simply be overwhelmed with sensory overload. Now, memory is simply the bias in which neurons will be replayed again by the brain, which remember carries the information of the physical stimuli that has come into your body. For example, if you can remember your name, that means there are specific chains of neurons in your brain that represent your name. And when those neurons connect with one another in a particular sequence, you remember your name. Were that particular chain of neurons disrupted, for whichever reason, you will not remember your name. As you can tell, neurons are fundamentally important to forming memories. And even though there are approximately 100 billion of them, my favourite part about them is that they can't be wasted. Let's say I'm using neurons to temporarily remember the colour of a pencil I'm using. In a month, I certainly will have forgotten this. So these neurons can be reused to remember new information. This is a result of neuroplasticity. So I've explained at the biological level how memories are formed. But why do we remember some things but not other things? And how can we leverage this information to our benefit? By far, the main reason why we remember some things and not other things is repetition. The more times you repeat doing something, for example, the more times you learn a piece of information for a test, the more that given chain of neurons remembering that particular piece of information is strengthened. The stronger a chain of neurons is, the stronger the chance you have of remembering that information the chain of neurons is withholding. A fascinating study by Ebbinghaus illustrates how repetition improves our memory. His friends wrote down a bunch of random numbers in a sequence, and after looking at them for a while, he then tried to write them all down, solely relying on his memory to do so. As you'd expect, the more times he repeated the process, the more numbers he remembered. I've actually done this exact experiment accidentally a year ago, albeit the numbers weren't random. For some reason, I decided to learn the first 100 digits of pi for a laugh. And I quit at around the 70 mark, but yeah, I learned the first 70 digits of pi, and the reason for that is that I would just go on this app, remember all the numbers, and through repetition, I would slowly learn more and more numbers. Say, the first time I got about 5, then 10, then 12, and I worked my way up like a sadder that I am, all the way to the first 70 digits of pi through repetition. Now, I think I've clearly established that most of the time we learn something is because existing neurons have had their connections strengthened through repetition numerous times. Occasionally, however, we will learn something without repetition, and this is a product of chains of neurons that withhold new information being very strongly activated just once and only once. What this refers to is called one trial learning, where we experience something and we remember that thing forever. Unfortunately, most of the time this is associated with negative events, but it can also be associated with positive events. For example, the first time seeing your child. The reason that one-trial learning can occur is emotion. Simply put, emotionally intensive events are much more memorable than much less emotionally intensive events, with the most emotionally intensive events of course being remembered the most. This is due to the release of either adrenaline, cortisol, or both of these chemicals together. When these chemicals are released after experiencing something, you are essentially stamping down those experiences that you have just had and are much more likely to remember that particular thing. There are numerous studies I can give to back this up. For example, there was a study where people have a cold shower to release adrenaline, then after try to remember a random paragraph they have read. At a different time, under the same environment, they also read a similar paragraph, but without the cold shower, and therefore without any release of adrenaline at all. It was found that the increase of adrenaline decreased the need for a repetition to learn. As you can imagine, you probably don't want to submerge your body into cold water every time you want to learn something. So note that any practice that releases adrenaline and cortisol, for example consuming a coffee, which I have made a whole video detailing and recommend you watch, can just as effectively increase the chances that you remember that specific thing. A study of rats that were placed in an arena were shocked in a particular place in that arena and would not return to that specific part of the arena that they were shocked at again, because the release of adrenaline created a strong memory of that shock, even though they were only shocked there once. The rats didn't want to get shocked again, and hence they didn't return to that particular place. As you've probably gathered, this is an example of one-trial learning, and it further highlights how the more emotionally intense an event is, alongside how much you repeat something, the more likely you are to form and withhold such memory. I could give an exhaustive list of studies that highlight this, but I will leave this topic with just one more example. In medieval times, communities threw young children in the river when they wanted to remember important events. They believed that throwing a child in the water after witnessing historic proceedings would leave a lifelong memory for the child of the events that they had just seen. And well, it turns out they were right. I want to note, however, that despite it being clear that adrenaline and stress can increase the ability to learn something, you should not chronically increase your adrenaline when trying to learn. For example, having 50 cold showers a day in an attempt to remember as much as possible is not effective or rational whatsoever. It's not the absolute amount of adrenaline in your body that helps learn memories. Instead, work from scientists have shown it's the amount of adrenaline you release relative to the amount of adrenaline that was in your system just prior. It's the difference in the adrenaline that makes the difference. If you have your adrenaline high throughout the whole day due to coffees, cold showers, high intensity exercise, and whatever else, it's only at the start where you are going from little adrenaline to high adrenaline. That is when you first wake up, assuming you aren't waking up in a high adrenaline state, that this will help stamp down such memories. Therefore, a very calm yet alert state followed by a spike in adrenaline afterwards is therefore optimal to improve in learning in this regard. For further information on how the more emotionally intense events in our lives can increase the chance you memorize something in comparison to more dull and boring events, I've linked a really interesting study in the description. I'm now going to discuss two more topics, the first one being how certain conditions affect one's ability to memorize information, and secondly how the way you note information affects such as well. Numerous conditions affect memory. It would be impossible to cover a full list of all conditions that do so, and therefore I've included just 3 conditions I found interesting when exploring this subject. Firstly, dementia is an umbrella term for symptoms like decline in memory, reasoning, and other thinking skills. I never understood the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and didn't realise Alzheimer's disease was a specific form of dementia. Specifically, it accounts for 60 to 80% of dementia cases. Dementia is a terminal condition, and so unfortunately it can't be prevented once you have it. I mentioned in my video about cholesterol how cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the world, but in the UK, where I live, I was surprised and felt compelled to share that dementia and Alzheimer's disease specifically is the leading cause of death. In 2018, it accounted for 12.7% of deaths in the UK. Dementia is caused by damage to brain cells, specifically neurons and glials, which at an old age can't be replaced when they are lost, leading to a decline in memory, reasoning, behaviour, swallowing, speaking, and more. Its cause is both by genetics and lifestyle factors, and recently scientists have discovered how protein can create a plaque on the brain and create dementia, although the research needs to be further developed. ADHD, aka Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, affects memory because lack of focus makes it harder to learn new things and also recall information that they have previously learned. The frontal lobe of the brain, which steers your impulse control, attentiveness, and memory, seems to develop more slowly if you have ADHD. Common short-term memory challenges in ADHD include forgetting what was just said or read, difficulty following multiple step instructions, losing track of thoughts mid-conversation, struggling to remember items on a mental to-do list, difficulty performing mental calculations, and anything else that sustains prolonged mental focus. Dyslexia is another condition that can make it hard to memorize things alongside the difficulty of recognizing words, spellings, converting patterns of letters into their associated sounds, and even maths. Children and adults suffering from dyslexia may find that their short-term and working memory may not be as functional as those around them, as outlined by a meta-analysis that I will link in the description. It must be noted though that the two studies used to study the effects of memory that dyslexia has only had a sample size of 17 and 28 dyslexic people respectively, and so further research on the topic clearly needs to be done, despite both studies concluding dyslexia does impact short-term memory and working memory. In other sources I've looked at, it's also become clear that further research needs to be done on this effect that dyslexia has on short-term and working memory. There simply isn't enough research that has been done on it yet. While it is known that dyslexia is genetically inherited, the disorder's cause remains a mystery. There is still so much research that needs to be done on it. There is no explanation to why certain people and families are afflicted with dyslexia and other people in the same family aren't. Not all dyslexia is the same as well. It has a spectrum where it can be extremely harsh and also extremely mild. Approximately 10% of people have some degree of dyslexia in the UK, according to the NHS website. I want to end this video discussing the debate of taking notes via pen and paper in comparison to a laptop, as well as the people that claim to have a particular type of learning style when trying to learn new information. I quote and agree with Gretchen Whitman in her study when she mentions how the idea of learning styles or differences in how people learn appeals to so many educators as a way of meeting their students' individual needs, despite decades of research showing that learning styles theory is a neuromyth. The practice continues. There is no empirical research that shows matching a student's preferred learning style to instructions produces better learning outcomes. In fact, there is no correlation between learning style and academic performance. Instruments used to determine a learning style were self-reported and unreliable. Focusing on one learning style does students a disservice by preventing them from developing their skills in other areas. The learning style myth continues due to deep-seated belief among educators, commercial enterprises, students, and parents. School administrators, educators, and teachers need to focus on employing research-based approaches instead of using practices for which there is no evidence of positively impacting student learning. There are several research-based practices that more effectively meeting students' learning needs, I should say, such as active learning and culturally responsive teaching. Once again, I need to burp there, to quote Gretchen Whitman in her study, which I will link in the description below. On the topic of how notes should be taken in class by students, a famous study by Pam Mueller and Daniel Oppenheimer in 2014 concluded that note-taking with a pen and notepad is better than on a computer. This was primarily due to the notes being written slower, making it easier for the notes to be understood when written, but also due to other reasons, like computers potentially distracting the online note taker through notifications. It should be noted though, see what I did there, that because you can note things faster on a computer than you can on a notepad, other studies have indicated the opposite, that typing notes on a computer is more efficient. In Mueller and Oppenheimer's study, to me at least, it's clear that if you aren't distracted by other functions of your computer and are thoroughly processing the notes you are typing, just like you would with a pen and notepad, it's completely fine to type your notes. In my opinion, it's actually better. So I remember when I was in sixth form, it was a pain to convert my notes, which were written on a notepad on paper, into online flashcards on this app called Anki. If my notes were online, it would have been much easier to make these notes into online flashcards. Alongside this, notepads over time can be poor for storage, management, images, and searching for specific things, which can be done with ease on a computer. It's for these reasons that I personally prefer to note information I am learning on a laptop rather than on a notepad. This is the end of the video. I have included the things that I found interesting but didn't put in this video in the description, alongside the studies I've also used. Feel free to take a look at them. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment in the description below. Comment section, not description. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and